All right, today we're tackling a really serious brain disorder, one that's hiding in plain sight way too often: Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but what it does to the brain is actually devastatingly simple. And it often starts with a name you might have heard kicked around.
Have you ever heard the term wet brain? It's kind of a harsh, slangy name, but it points to a very real, very dangerous process that's often linked with long-term heavy drinking. So what's really going on inside the brain? Let's break it down.
You see, the first thing you've got to understand is that Wernicke-Korsakoff isn't just one thing. It's more like a 2-act story of brain damage. Act 1 is Wernicke's encephalopathy. This is an acute medical emergency, but, and this is key, it's potentially reversible. If you miss that window, you get to Act 2, Korsakoff syndrome. And that's chronic, largely irreversible brain damage. So let's start with Act 1, Wernicke's encephalopathy. This is the crisis point. This is the moment where everything hangs in the balance and quick action can literally change the entire outcome. So what is it? Put simply, Wernicke's encephalopathy is a sudden brain disorder, and it's all caused by a major lack of thiamine, or vitamin B1. I want to be really clear here. This is a full-blown medical emergency. Time is absolutely critical. For a long time, doctors have been taught to look for this so-called classic triad of symptoms. You've got confusion, like really altered mental status. Then there's ataxia. That's a lack of coordination, making people walk like they're incredibly unsteady. And finally, weird eye movements. Seems pretty straightforward, right? A clear checklist. Well, here's the kicker, and this is truly shocking. Only about 16.5% of patients, that's less than 1 in 5, actually show all 3 of those classic symptoms at the same time. Think about that. This is a huge reason it gets missed. Doctors are looking for this perfect textbook example, but that patient almost never walks through the door. And when that diagnosis gets missed, that's what leaves us straight into Act 2, Korsakoff syndrome. This is what happens when that initial emergency isn't treated and the damage becomes permanent. So Korsakoff's is the chronic, long-term consequence of that first crisis. The damage is now pretty much baked in, and the main feature is just a devastating, profound loss of memory. The signature symptom here is something called anterograde amnesia. This just means you can't form new memories. I mean, just try to imagine that. You could meet someone new, have a whole conversation, and literally 5 minutes later, it's just gone. Your life becomes a string of moments that just don't connect. Now, to deal with all these empty spaces in their memory, the brain does something incredible and tragic. It confabulates. It just makes stuff up to fill in the blanks. It's not lying, it's the brain's desperate attempt to build a story that makes sense when all the real pages have been torn out. Yeah, this quote from the Alzheimer's Association really hits the nail on the head. It's so important to get this. The person who is confabulating isn't trying to pull one over on you. To them, that invented memory feels completely real. It's a coping mechanism, not a con. So how does all of this happen? I mean, how does a brain get to a point of such irreversible damage from what started as a treatable issue? Incredibly, it all comes down to one single missing vitamin. Here's a good way to think about it. Thiamine is basically the electricity that powers your brain cells. It's what lets them turn sugar into energy. So when you don't have enough thiamine, those cells can't power up. It's like a massive system-wide power failure in your brain. In this diagram here, it really shows you the vicious cycle, especially with chronic alcohol abuse. It's just a perfect storm for this deficiency. First off, alcohol can take the place of actual nutritious food. Then it messes with your gut, so you can't even absorb the little bit of thiamine you do get. And to top it all off, it hits the liver, which is like your body's little thiamine storage unit, basically draining your backup battery completely. This power failure isn't just a temporary blackout. Over time, that lack of energy leads to real physical destruction of brain tissue. You can actually see it. Just look at these 2 MRI scans. On one side, you've got a healthier brain structure. On the other, the brain of a patient with Korsakoff's. You don't need to be a radiologist to see the damage. The empty space, the shrinkage, that is the physical scar left behind when brain cells are starved of energy for too long. And more specifically, what you're seeing is damage in these critical memory hubs of the brain, places that are supposed to act like relay stations for making and recalling memories. The connections between the 2 halves of the brain start to wither. It's a widespread breakdown that just sabotages the whole system. Okay, so what's the bottom line here? This all sounds incredibly bleak, I know.
But the most important part of this whole story is about prevention and the absolute desperate need for urgent treatment. Because look, the stakes are unbelievably high. If Wernicke's isn't treated, up to 20% of patients just die. Of the people who survive that initial phase, a staggering 85% will go on to develop Korsakoffs, and a quarter of those folks will need to be in a long-term care facility for the rest of their lives. And even beyond that, the long-term outlook is just grim. The data shows that 50% of patients who have an alcohol-related Wernicke's episode are expected to die within 8 years. The damage goes way beyond just memory. But here's the thing, there is hope. We know how to treat this, and it works, if you catch it in time. The protocol is crystal clear. You hit the patient with high-dose IV thiamine, and you do it immediately. Now listen to this next part, because it is absolutely critical. You have to give the thiamine before or with any glucose. If you give a patient sugar first, you can actually make the brain damage worse, faster. After that, you work on fixing other stuff, like a magnesium deficiency, which actually helps the thiamine get to work. So the real takeaway here is simple. Early, aggressive intervention with a simple vitamin can stop a lifetime of irreversible brain damage in its tracks. This is, at its very core, a preventable tragedy. And that just leaves us with this one final, really haunting question. If we know the cause, and we have the treatment, a simple vitamin, why is this condition still being missed in up to 80% of cases? It's a question that really forces us to think about awareness, about diagnosis, and about a devastating disorder that is still, for so many, hiding in plain sight.